Across the western edge of Asia, where open plains meet the rugged hills of Anatolia, the early 13th century unfolds with unusual quiet. Great powers that once shaped these lands have weakened. The Seljuk state has fractured into small principalities. Byzantine fortresses stand undermanned along the frontier. Trade routes drift between safety and neglect. The region feels unsettled, suspended between what has ended and what has not yet begun. Into this landscape come scattered groups of Turkish families, recently displaced by the sweeping force of the Mongol advance. They travel with modest belongings, herds, and traditions carried from the Central Asian steppe. Among them is a small community that settles near the Byzantine borderlands, led by a man named Osman. His territory is humble, little more than a cluster of villages, patches of grazing land, and a few wooden forts. It is not yet the beginning of an empire. It is the beginning of survival. Here, on a frontier shaped by uncertainty, conditions quietly align in remarkable ways. The land lacks a strong central authority. Local rulers compete for influence, often with more ambition than resources. Byzantine defenses are stretched thin, unable to respond to every raid or rebellion. Religious identity strengthens bonds within frontier groups, drawing warriors who see opportunity in defending the faith along shifting borders. Mobility, discipline, and a tradition of steppe warfare give Osman's followers a distinct advantage in a region defined by movement and instability. What emerges first is not an empire, but a reputation. Osman's leadership attracts families seeking protection and warriors seeking purpose. His successes, small at the beginning, suggest a leader who understands the frontier better than his rivals. A captured outpost, a defended village, a negotiated alliance. Each event builds a sense of continuity, a slow but steady rise. As this community grows, so does its structure. Osman's son Orhan later organizes the first institutions of governance, turning what was once a loose tribal group into a functioning state. Towns begin to flourish. Markets take shape. The earliest forms of administration and taxation appear. These developments do not happen suddenly. They unfold gradually, shaped by the needs of a growing population and the pressures of a competitive region. The frontier setting continues to play a central role. Opportunities emerge from the weakening of Byzantine control in northwestern Anatolia. Local populations, weary of instability, often prefer a nearby Turkish leader who offers order over a distant authority who cannot enforce it. This environment allows the Beylik to expand carefully, expanding its borders without drawing attention from stronger neighboring powers. What gives this early rise its momentum is a combination of circumstance and discipline. Osman's followers operate as Ghazi warriors, fighters who blend religious purpose with frontier survival. Their presence gives the Beylik a distinct identity, one that inspires loyalty and draws new supporters into its orbit. Victories reinforce belief in the state's future. Each success becomes a foundation for the next. As decades pass, the Beylik grows more confident. New lands are incorporated. New administrative systems take shape. The early Ottoman state begins to develop the balance of flexibility and structure that will define it for centuries. It becomes clear that this is no longer just one of many small principalities scattered across Anatolia. It is a rising power shaped by its environment, strengthened by its discipline, and prepared, though no one yet realizes it, to cross both physical and historical thresholds. From these modest beginnings, an empire will eventually emerge. But in this moment, before the great conquests, before the janissaries, before the sieges that will redefine the Mediterranean, the story is still a quiet one. A frontier Beylik, a determined leader, and a landscape full of openings waiting to be recognized. This is how the rise begins. Not with spectacle, but with steady movement. Not with grand declarations, but with the slow gathering of strength in a region where the future belongs to those who understand the shifting ground beneath their feet. Across the wide interior of Central Asia, where the grasslands stretch so far that horizon and sky seem to merge, countless generations of nomadic families once lived by the rhythm of the steppe. Their world was shaped not by cities or borders, but by movement. Horses provided mobility, herds provided life, and the seasons dictated the pattern of each year. For centuries, this landscape supported tribes whose skills in riding, archery, and survival made them some of the most adaptable people of the medieval world. It was from this environment that the ancestors of the early Ottoman settlers emerged. They were part of a larger wave of Oghuz Turks, communities accustomed to long migrations, unfamiliar with the idea of fixed borders, and deeply tied to traditions carried across the plains. Their identity was shaped by kinship, loyalty, and the ability to endure hardship. Nothing about their early life suggested the construction of an empire. What they knew was how to move, how to fight, and how to adapt. The 13th century brought changes that altered the direction of their story. Far to the east, the Mongol Empire expanded with unprecedented force, reshaping the political map of Asia. As Mongol armies advanced, many Turkic tribes faced a choice: resist and risk destruction, or withdraw westward in search of safer ground. The decision to migrate was not taken at once, but through many smaller movements, families and clans adjusting to the shifting pressures around them. These migrations eventually brought thousands of Turkic families into the region of Anatolia. Here, the landscape changed. Rolling plains gave way to hills, forests, mountain valleys, and the remains of roads and fortresses built by older civilizations. The land was unfamiliar, yet it offered something essential: space to settle, openings to occupy, and the possibility of building a new life at the edge of the collapsing Seljuk world. Anatolia itself was in transition. The once powerful Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had weakened under internal disputes and Mongol pressure. Authority fractured into smaller states, each ruled by local beys who controlled pockets of territory. Byzantine influence, long a defining force in the region, had retreated to fortified cities and scattered strongholds along the frontier. Towns that had once been securely administered now existed in a fragile balance between competing powers. The region felt unsteady, waiting for something to fill the void left by the decline of established rulers. Into this fragmented landscape, the migrating tribes found a place where their skills mattered. Their experience with horses made them valuable as frontier fighters. Their ability to move quickly across difficult terrain allowed them to navigate areas where larger armies struggled. Their traditions of loyalty to a leader made them effective in small, cohesive groups. In a land where order was uncertain, these qualities created opportunities. Among the many families settling in northwestern Anatolia was the group led by Ertugrul, traditionally remembered as the father of Osman. Historical records from this period are sparse, yet the memory preserved by later generations portrays a leader who guided his followers through displacement into stability. The land they occupied bordered weakened Byzantine territories, lands where authority had thinned, leaving gaps that could be exploited by those willing to take risks. Here, the fundamentals of what would later become the Ottoman state began to take shape. Settlements grew around the camps of the migrating tribes. Agricultural lands were cultivated, often in cooperation with local populations. Markets emerged in places where trade routes still carried goods from one urban center to another. A pattern developed: protect the land, secure the people, and gradually absorb the surrounding territory. The frontier environment shaped their daily reality. There were long stretches of quiet, broken by sudden threats. Fortresses sat on hilltops, watching over valleys where shepherds tended flocks. Byzantine villages struggled with limited resources. Small bands of warriors from various beyliks patrolled borders that shifted from year to year. For newcomers, the frontier offered a combination of danger and possibility. It rewarded those who could respond quickly, defend their communities, and offer stability to local populations who often cared less about political loyalty than about safety and steady harvests. The Turks who settled here learned the rhythms of this land just as they had learned the rhythms of the steppe. Osman, who would soon give his name to the rising state, grew into leadership within this environment. Unlike later sultans whose authority rested on formal institutions, Osman led through direct relationships, through loyalty built in the field, through personal reputation, through the trust of warriors who relied on him for direction. His early followers were not administrators or court officials, but frontier fighters, farmers, and families whose future depended on the success of their community. The geographic setting also played a quiet but decisive role. Northwestern Anatolia lay close to the Sea of Marmara, a region connected to trade routes running toward both the Balkans and central Anatolia. It bordered weakened Byzantine lands whose defenses were often symbolic rather than effective. It offered forests, water, pasture, and access to transport routes without the oversight of a powerful central authority. These factors created a delicate balance: enough structure to sustain settlement, but enough instability to allow ambitious leaders to expand. The culture of the early settlers blended their steppe heritage with the realities of their new home. They retained mobility, even as they began adopting more settled practices. They relied on traditional methods of warfare while gradually learning siege tactics from local communities. Their spiritual life drew from Sufi traditions that emphasized loyalty, discipline, and devotion, a combination that helped unite people across different backgrounds. By the late 13th century, the outlines of something larger were beginning to appear, though nothing yet suggested the scale of what would come. Osman's territory remained modest. His following was still small compared to other regional powers, but the conditions that allowed for growth were firmly in place. A fragmented political landscape, a leader gaining reputation, a loyal core of warriors, and a frontier filled with opportunities for expansion. In these early years, the rise of the Ottomans did not look like the beginning of an empire. It looked like a community learning how to survive, then learning how to lead, then learning how to shape the world around them. Step by step, settlement by settlement, the foundations of a state were being laid in a region where almost no one was watching closely. The steppe origins of these people were not lost in the transition. Their mobility, resilience, and ability to adapt remained central to their identity. What changed was the environment, from open plains to a frontier of forests, mountains, and abandoned lands, and the opportunities that environment offered. In this quiet transformation, the earliest phase of Ottoman history unfolded, setting the stage for a rise that would soon become impossible to ignore. When the Ottomans first appeared in northwestern Anatolia, the region stood at a crossroads between fading structures and emerging powers. Nothing about this land resembled a stable kingdom. Instead, it carried traces of collapsed authority, shifting alliances, and borders that no longer held their shape. This fragmentation created a landscape where small states rose and fell with unusual speed, and where even a modest Beylik could grow into something far greater. The roots of this fragmentation stretched back to the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Once a dominant force in Anatolia, the Seljuks had ruled over cities, trade routes, and agricultural lands with a mixture of military strength and administrative skill. But by the late 13th century, internal disputes, economic strain, and the pressure of Mongol overlordship left the Sultanate weakened beyond repair. Central authority no longer reached the edges of the territory. Provincial leaders acted independently. The unity that once defined the region dissolved into smaller pockets of semi-autonomous control. Out of this dissolution emerged the Beyliks, small principalities ruled by local leaders who commanded loyalty through personal authority rather than inherited bureaucracy. Some Beyliks controlled fertile land along the Aegean coast. Others centered around fortified hill towns. A few occupied strategic passes where merchants and armies once traveled regularly. Each Beylik reflected the conditions of the land it occupied. Some prospered briefly before being absorbed by stronger neighbors. Others survived by forming alliances, trading for resources, or seeking protection from more powerful states. In this environment, Osman's community remained one of the least assuming. It was positioned near the Byzantine frontier, far from major cities, major markets, or established centers of power. Resources were limited. Landscape varied between forested slopes and small plains, providing enough for modest settlement, but not enough to attract larger rivals. Yet the very weakness of this position contained hidden advantages. Proximity to a declining Byzantine authority meant that Osman's Beylik faced an opponent whose defenses were inconsistent and whose territory was often thinly populated. Raids across the border could yield land or supplies without provoking powerful retaliation. Local Christian villages sometimes preferred stable Muslim rule over distant Byzantine oversight, especially when that oversight came irregularly and offered little protection. The Seljuk decline also meant that Osman faced no single Muslim rival strong enough to challenge him directly. Larger Beyliks concentrated their efforts on more fertile lands to the south and west, leaving Osman's frontier zone relatively uncontested. While other rulers competed for cities or agricultural wealth, Osman expanded into areas that were lightly defended and whose potential was not yet fully recognized. But expansion alone did not define the Beylik. The early Ottoman state grew slowly, shaped by pragmatic decisions and careful adaptation. Osman needed to balance tribal loyalty with emerging administrative needs. He had to maintain the trust of warriors who expected rewards, while also ensuring that newly settled communities felt protected enough to remain. These challenges encouraged forms of leadership that relied on negotiation, inclusion, and flexibility. A significant part of Osman's success came from his ability to integrate different groups into a cohesive whole. His followers included Turkic warriors accustomed to the traditions of the steppe, but also local converts, craftsmen, farmers, and families seeking stability. This diversity required a leadership style that could bridge cultural differences. Osman provided this through a combination of hospitality, religious legitimacy, and military effectiveness. People joined him because they believed he could offer what the fragmented region often failed to provide: continuity. The frontier environment offered both a testing ground and a source of opportunity. Fortified Byzantine outposts stood as reminders of a once powerful empire, now struggling to maintain influence over its Anatolian lands. Roads that once connected major cities now carried far fewer travelers, leaving small villages vulnerable to bandits or abandoned entirely. Herds grazed where fields had been left untended. Every empty space, every neglected valley, every weakened garrison represented a chance for expansion. Osman's Beylik capitalized on these opportunities not through sudden conquest, but through steady accumulation. A captured fort might be repaired and turned into a base for further operations. A surrendered village might retain its population under new protection. Land redistributed among loyal warriors encouraged settlement and guaranteed continued service. Borders expanded quietly, shaped more by the movement of people than by declarations of statehood. Underlying this development was a shared identity built around the idea of the Ghazi frontier, the belief that fighting along the border between Islamic and Christian territories carried both spiritual value and material reward. Whether every participant was motivated equally by faith or by practical concerns is difficult to determine, but the ideology helped unify Osman's supporters. It provided a narrative that explained their purpose and justified their ambitions. In a region without strong states, such narratives mattered deeply. They created cohesion where formal institutions were absent. They encouraged individuals to remain loyal even when rewards were uncertain. They framed expansion not as aggression but as the natural extension of their role on the frontier. The Beylik also benefited from its relatively small size. Large states often struggled with communication, logistics, and the rapid movement of troops. Osman, by contrast, operated with agility. His warriors could respond quickly to threats or opportunities. Decisions were made through direct interaction rather than distant councils. This agility allowed the Beylik to grow in ways that larger powers could not easily predict or counter. By the end of the 13th century, Osman's territory had expanded enough to draw notice from neighboring rulers. Though still modest compared to other Beyliks, it had become something more than a cluster of villages. It possessed a functioning structure of leadership, a growing military reputation, and a population whose identity was gradually shifting from tribal affiliation to political belonging. The fragmentation of Anatolia, which at first appeared as an obstacle, had become a landscape where Osman's Beylik could thrive. The absence of a dominant authority allowed smaller powers to establish themselves. The decline of Byzantine control provided a direction for expansion. The movements of Turkic tribes supplied a steady influx of people familiar with frontier life. Osman's Beylik rose quietly within this fragmented world, shaped as much by circumstance as by leadership. It occupied a space overlooked by rivals, yet full of potential. It built its foundations on the needs of a region longing for stability and on the opportunities presented by political disorder. Nothing about this early phase indicated the vast empire that would follow, but the essential elements were already present: a flexible society, a strategic frontier position, a leader capable of unifying disparate groups, and a landscape that rewarded those who could adapt to its shifting contours. These beginnings, though unremarkable at first glance, formed the bedrock of the Ottoman rise. Across the shifting borderlands of northwestern Anatolia, life in the late 13th century unfolded under the constant presence of uncertainty. Villages sat between worlds, To one side, the remnants of Byzantine territory weakened by internal struggles. To the other, a mosaic of Turkic beyliks, each pursuing its own survival and expansion. The space between these worlds formed the frontier, a zone where cultures blended, authority weakened, and opportunity emerged for those able to navigate its changing rhythms. It was here that Osman's community began to define itself not only as a beylik, but as a frontier society shaped by the idea of the Ghazi, the warrior who stood at the border between faiths, protecting the Muslim world while seeking new lands to support his community. The Ghazi identity did not develop from a single event or decree. It emerged gradually from the lived experience of the frontier, where conflict and coexistence intertwined, and where local populations often valued order more than the distant claims of great empires. The appeal of the Ghazi ideal lay in its ability to unify diverse groups around a shared sense of purpose. For some, it carried deep spiritual meaning. For others, it offered a practical framework, the chance to obtain land, wealth, or status in a region where opportunity was unevenly distributed. Warriors came to Osman's Beylik not only from Turkic tribes, but from various frontier backgrounds. Converts, adventurers, displaced families, and individuals seeking new beginnings found space within the growing community. This mix of people created a social environment that was flexible and adaptive. Loyalty was built less on lineage and more on shared experience. Success in battle reinforced trust in leadership. The Beylik became a place where reputation mattered more than ancestry, a characteristic that allowed Osman to attract individuals with valuable skills, soldiers familiar with Byzantine tactics, locals who knew the terrain, and craftsmen whose work supported frontier life. The geography of Osman's territory played a direct role in the Beylik's early expansion. Forested hills, narrow passes, and rivers defined the land, creating natural obstacles for large armies, but ideal conditions for small, mobile forces. Osman's warriors learned to move swiftly through this landscape, using their familiarity with the terrain to conduct surprise raids, protect their own settlements, and disrupt enemy supply routes. These actions were not dramatic in scale, but they produced tangible results, captured outposts, expanded grazing lands, and increased security for their people. The Byzantine frontier in this region had grown increasingly vulnerable. Many fortresses were understaffed, their defenses weakened by the empire's internal struggles. Local populations often lived with little support from Constantinople, and some communities found cooperation with their Turkish neighbors more practical than continued loyalty to distant rulers. As Osman's influence grew, villages along the border began to shift allegiance, preferring stable protection over uncertain imperial oversight. Each shift in allegiance reinforced the idea that the Beylik could provide what others could not: continuity, order, and a degree of prosperity. With new lands came new resources, fields to cultivate, water sources to secure, and trade routes to monitor. The Beylik's economy grew in small but steady increments, supporting a population that was beginning to see itself as part of something larger. Osman's early victories were not sweeping conquests. They were precise, targeted actions shaped by a deep understanding of frontier life. A fortress taken after a period of observation. A garrison persuaded to surrender rather than resist. A bridge secured to control movement across a river. These events expanded the Beylik's territory gradually, allowing it to strengthen its holdings before advancing further. The Ghazi ethos added momentum to this process. It framed expansion not as an act of aggression, but as the natural duty of a frontier leader. This perspective encouraged warriors to remain loyal even when the rewards were slow to appear. It also attracted new volunteers, strengthening the Beylik with a constant infusion of manpower. As Osman's reputation grew, neighboring powers began to take notice. Some, recognizing his potential, sought alliances or peaceful coexistence. Others viewed the rising Beylik as a potential threat. Yet Osman's careful expansion ensured that conflicts remained manageable. He avoided direct confrontation with stronger rivals, choosing instead to consolidate control over accessible areas and respond strategically to provocations. The success of this approach depended on more than military skill. It required a subtle understanding of local dynamics. Some regions were incorporated through force, others through negotiation. In many cases, Osman's followers respected existing social structures, allowing local leaders to retain influence under Ottoman protection. This method created fewer disruptions and made transitions smoother for the populations involved. The development of early administrative practices added another layer to the Beylik stability. Though simple compared to later Ottoman bureaucracy, these practices helped organize land distribution, taxation, and legal matters. Warriors received land in exchange for service, creating an incentive to defend and cultivate newly acquired territories. Disputes were resolved through agreed procedures, giving residents confidence in their leadership. Markets grew in places where trade routes crossed, connecting the Beylik to larger regional networks. Over time, a quiet transformation occurred. The Beylik was no longer merely a collection of settlements. It was becoming a functioning state with identifiable borders, leadership structures, and economic foundations. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It took shape through years of gradual adaptation, influenced by both opportunity and necessity. The frontier played a central role throughout this process. It was a place where the boundaries of identity were flexible, where alliances shifted frequently, and where survival depended on quick responses to changing conditions. Osman's ability to read this environment, to understand when to advance, when to negotiate, and when to wait, positioned his Beylik for continued growth. By the early years of the 14th century, the expansion initiated under Osman's leadership had given his community both confidence and direction. The Beylik was still small compared to some of its neighbors, but it possessed qualities that would become the foundation of future success: mobility, cohesion, adaptability, and a growing belief in its own destiny along the frontier. In this landscape of uncertainty and opportunity, the Ottomans learned how to rise, not through overwhelming force, but through persistence, understanding, and the careful weaving of relationships that allowed the Beylik to expand without losing its core identity. The Ghazi frontier, once simply the backdrop of their existence, had become the engine of their early growth. When Osman's Beylik passed into the hands of his son Orhan, the transformation from a frontier community into a functioning state entered a new phase. The years of Osman's leadership had created momentum, but it was under Orhan that this momentum settled into structure. The Beylik was no longer a small gathering of warriors testing its place on the frontier. It now held territory, people, and responsibilities that required more than intuition and personal authority. It required the beginnings of governance. Orhan inherited a world that still carried the marks of fragmentation. The Byzantine Empire struggled with internal conflicts and economic strain. Many of its Anatolian territories had slipped into a condition where garrisons were underpaid, villages were sparsely protected, and loyalties fluctuated depending on who could offer stability. Other Turkish beyliks, though often larger than his own, were occupied with their own rivalries and disputes. The region remained open, unpredictable, and full of opportunities for a ruler who could navigate its shifting conditions with care. Orhan's leadership style differed from his father's, shaped less by the need to define a new community and more by the need to organize an expanding one. He continued the gradual territorial expansion begun by Osman, but he also recognized that conquest alone did not sustain a state. Land needed oversight. Populations needed reassurance. Trade routes needed protection. The authority of the ruler had to be visible not only in battle, but in administration. One of Orhan's first significant achievements was the capture of Bursa. The city, strategically placed and economically active, became something the Beylik had not yet possessed, an urban center capable of supporting administrative life. Bursa offered markets, artisans, agricultural hinterlands, and access to surrounding routes. Its fortifications, once held by a weakened Byzantine defense, now came under Ottoman control. For the first time, the Beylik could anchor itself not just in villages and frontier forts, but in a city whose walls and institutions gave a sense of permanence. With Bursa, the Ottomans gained a capital worthy of their ambitions. It allowed Orhan to administer justice, collect taxes, and supervise trade with greater efficiency. It became a center where scribes began recording transactions with increasing regularity, where scholars and jurists offered guidance on matters of law, and where soldiers could gather before embarking on campaigns. The city's markets connected the Beylik to wider economic networks, drawing merchants who now recognized Ottoman territory as a stable space in an otherwise uncertain landscape. Yet the significance of Bursa lay not only in its physical attributes. It symbolized the shift from a mobile frontier group to a settled state with a claim to continuity. It allowed Orhan to create the impression that the Ottomans were not merely passing through history, but establishing their place within it. To support this new stability, Orhan introduced reforms that strengthened the administrative foundation of the Beylik. He appointed officials responsible for different regions, ensuring that local disputes reached the central authority rather than escalating unchecked. Land was distributed to soldiers in exchange for continued service, creating a system where military loyalty intertwined with agricultural productivity. This arrangement encouraged settlement, as warriors who received land brought their families and invested in the well-being of the territory. Orhan also recognized the importance of religion in unifying his diverse subjects. Under his rule, new mosques and religious schools, medreses, were established, including one of the earliest Ottoman medreses in Iznik. These institutions provided religious guidance, taught law, and reinforced the legitimacy of Ottoman rule within a broader Islamic framework. They also created networks of scholars who contributed to the intellectual life of the state, strengthening its identity beyond military achievements. The formation of a state required not only civilian administration, but also a reliable military structure. During Orhan's rule, the Ottomans began to formalize their forces, distinguishing between tribal warriors and troops maintained directly by the ruler. This shift supported the steady expansion of the Beylik, making its military actions more predictable and effective. Mobile cavalry remained essential, but infantry units began to play a more organized role in sieges and defensive operations. Orhan's approach to expansion remained cautious and deliberate. He advanced into territories where resistance was limited, striking a balance between opportunity and risk. Towns along weakened Byzantine routes came under his control gradually, their populations often accepting Ottoman governance in exchange for protection and relative stability. Orhan preferred avoiding confrontation with stronger neighboring beyliks unless necessary, choosing instead to consolidate power in areas where the Ottomans could act with confidence. Diplomacy complemented military strategy. Orhan navigated relationships with neighboring beyliks through alliances, marriages, and agreements that reduced the likelihood of conflict. These relationships allowed him to focus on the lands that offered the greatest strategic advantage. Through careful calculation, he expanded the Beylik in a way that appeared natural rather than forced, weaving new territories into the Ottoman fabric with minimal disruption. The emergence of Ottoman coinage during Orhan's rule further strengthened the sense of statehood. Minting coins was more than a practical matter. It was a declaration that the Ottomans had entered the economic life of the region with their own identity. The appearance of Orhan's name on currency signaled a steady transition from tribal leadership to recognized sovereignty, and it reinforced the Beylik's legitimacy in trade and governance. Education, administration, military organization, and economic integration, each developed gradually during Orhan's reign, helped create a framework that could support long-term growth. The Beylik no longer relied solely on the charisma of a single leader or the spontaneity of frontier warfare. It now possessed the early elements of a state capable of endurance. Under Orhan, the Ottomans took on a form that was beginning to resemble the shape of later centuries. The foundations were still simple, the territories still modest, but the direction was clear. What had begun under Osman as a flexible frontier group now carried the weight of institutions, settlements, and responsibilities that signaled a future beyond local influence. By the time Orhan's rule matured, the Ottomans had secured a foothold in both western Anatolia and the surrounding frontier. They possessed a capital, an administration, a growing economy, and a reputation that extended far beyond their early borders. Their rise remained far from its peak, yet the essential transformation from a band of warriors to a structured state had already taken place. The next stages of expansion would rely on this foundation. Without the early state-building efforts under Orhan, the sweeping conquests of later generations would not have been possible. The Beylik that once seemed insignificant among many now carried within it the quiet strength of an emerging power. As the Ottoman Beylik expanded under Orhan's leadership, the need for a more dependable and organized military structure became increasingly clear. The frontier warriors who had served Osman so effectively remained important, But the shifting scale of the state required something more stable than temporary bands of fighters who assembled when called and dispersed once a campaign ended. To govern new lands, defend growing borders, and prepare for opportunities that appeared unpredictably along the frontier, the Ottomans needed forces that were always ready, always trained, and loyal not merely to a leader, but to the idea of the state itself. This realization developed gradually. The early Ottoman military remained a blend of tribal cavalry, volunteer ghazis, and auxiliary units from newly incorporated territories. But as Orhan consolidated his rule, he began forming units that stood apart from the fluid world of frontier warfare. These early standing forces marked one of the first major departures from the practices of the nomadic past. Instead of relying entirely on the spontaneity of tribal mobilization, the Ottomans created troops who received regular payment, operated under strict command, and could be deployed quickly without negotiating terms of service each time. The earliest of these troops were infantry units who served as the backbone of siege operations, garrisoned forts, guarded key roads, and enforced order in newly acquired settlements. They provided the stability that a growing state desperately needed. Cavalry remained central to the Ottoman style of warfare, but infantry offered something entirely different: a constant presence that shaped the Beylik's internal security and its ability to respond effectively to emergencies. Yet the most remarkable and influential development of this era was the gradual formation of the Janissaries, a corps that would become one of the most recognizable institutions of the Ottoman world. The origins of the Janissaries were not sudden. They emerged from a series of adjustments in recruitment, training, and organization, all aimed at creating a military force that was disciplined, loyal, and capable of adapting to new forms of warfare. The early Janissaries were recruited from young boys taken from among the Christian populations under Ottoman rule. This system, known later as the Devshirme, was not fully formalized in Orhan's time, but its foundations appeared during his reign. These boys were raised in the households of Muslim families or trained directly within the military system. They were taught Turkish, instructed in the faith, and trained in the skills expected of soldiers in the Ottoman army. What distinguished the Janissaries from other forces was not only their method of recruitment, but their environment of discipline and training. They were separated from tribal loyalties and raised to view the state as their family, the Sultan as their guardian, and military service as their primary identity. This created a level of cohesion and professionalism rare in the region at the time. The Janissaries trained in formations, practiced with a variety of weapons, and adapted to new technologies with unusual openness. As gunpowder spread slowly across the region, the Janissaries became among the first units to integrate firearms into their tactics. Their willingness to adopt new methods contrasted with other armies that resisted change due to tradition or lack of structure. The presence of a standing, disciplined corps also changed the way the Ottomans approached warfare. Campaigns could be planned with greater precision because commanders knew they had troops available at all times. Garrisons could be placed in newly conquered towns without relying solely on tribal warriors, who often preferred mobility and resisted long-term assignments. The Beylik could respond more effectively to rebellions, invasions, or unexpected threats. And, perhaps most importantly, the Janissaries formed a force that embodied loyalty to the state rather than to individual leaders. Their role extended beyond the battlefield. In peaceful times, they trained, maintained order, and reinforced the authority of the Sultan. They served as visible symbols of the state's growing power, a reminder that the Ottomans were no longer merely a frontier principality, but a rising political entity with the ability to enforce its will. The development of the Janissaries also had a broader social impact. It created pathways for individuals of humble origins to rise through the military ranks, developing skills and earning recognition based on merit rather than lineage. This helped integrate diverse populations into the Ottoman system and ensured that the army remained adaptable in a region where social lines often shifted. The military evolution did not occur in isolation. It reflected the broader transformation of the Ottoman state under Orhan. The expansion of territory demanded new kinds of administrative and logistical support. Roads needed protection, fortresses required permanent guards, and supply lines had to be secured. The Janissaries and other standing units provided the foundation for this stability, enabling the state to function more predictably. As the army became more organized, the Ottomans grew increasingly confident in their ability to pursue opportunities beyond their immediate borders. Campaigns could be conducted with more coordination. Sieges became more effective. The use of infantry in conjunction with cavalry created a balanced force capable of addressing a range of challenges. The Ottomans were no longer dependent solely on frontier raiders. They had built a military system capable of strategic execution. The formation of these forces also signaled a shift in the relationship between ruler and army. Loyalty, once built on personal charisma and tribal bonds, now rested on institutional frameworks. Soldiers were paid regularly from the treasury. They trained together, lived together, and developed a sense of identity tied directly to the Ottoman state. This transition laid the foundation for the more elaborate military and administrative systems that would appear in later centuries. By the time Orhan's rule matured, the Ottomans possessed an army unlike any in the region, a blend of traditional mounted warriors and emerging infantry forces supported by discipline, organization, and state oversight. This combination allowed them to expand in ways that other beyliks could not match. It gave them credibility in the eyes of local populations who sought stability. It positioned the Ottoman state to take advantage of opportunities in both Anatolia and the Balkans. The rise of the Janissaries, though still in its early form, demonstrated the Ottomans' willingness to innovate, adapt, and build structures capable of withstanding the pressures of an expanding state. The military machine taking shape would support every future conquest, every diplomatic negotiation, and every administrative reform. From this moment onward, the Ottomans no longer relied solely on the traditions they brought from the steppe. They were creating something new, a professional, structured military force that would become one of the most defining pillars of their eventual empire. As the Ottoman state strengthened in Anatolia through careful administration and the development of a stable military, a new horizon began to open before it. A horizon across the narrow waters of the Dardanelles toward the shores of southeastern Europe. This crossing would mark one of the most significant turning points in Ottoman history, not through a single grand campaign, but through a quiet sequence of events shaped by geography, opportunity, and the slow decline of Byzantine authority. For centuries, the cities and fortresses along the Sea of Marmara had served as gateways between two continents. They had seen armies march, merchants trade, and envoys travel between Europe and Asia. But by the mid-14th century, these routes had grown fragile. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal conflicts and civil wars, struggled to maintain its hold on the region. Fortresses were undermanned, supplies inconsistent, and local leaders found themselves increasingly isolated from Constantinople. It was in this fragile environment that the Ottomans made their first permanent step into Europe, not through a dramatic conquest, but through circumstances that unfolded almost quietly. The catalyst was an earthquake in 1354, a powerful tremor that shook the Gallipoli Peninsula. Several Byzantine fortresses, already weakened by age and neglect, suffered damage. Walls collapsed, towers cracked. Local populations were thrown into disarray, seeking safety while the imperial government struggled to respond. In this moment of vulnerability, the Ottomans moved quickly. Under the leadership of Suleiman Pasha, Orhan's son, Ottoman forces crossed the narrow strait and occupied the damaged fortress of Gallipoli. The crossing itself was not new. Frontier warriors had raided into Europe before, and Byzantine factions had even invited Turks as allies in their civil wars. But this time, the Ottomans did not withdraw. They repaired the fortress, strengthened their position, and treated Gallipoli not as temporary spoils, but as a foothold, a bridgehead on European soil. The significance of Gallipoli lay not only in its location, but in what it represented. For the first time, the Ottomans possessed a stable military base on the European continent, allowing them to move soldiers and supplies across the strait with greater efficiency. It linked their Anatolian territories to new regions of opportunity, regions whose political landscape had grown as fractured as that of Anatolia decades earlier. The Balkans in the mid-14th century were a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and local powers. Some were weakened by internal rivalries. Others faced threats from neighboring states. Many lacked the resources to respond effectively to a determined and organized force. The Ottomans, with their growing military machine and their ability to move fluidly between Anatolia and Europe, entered this landscape with advantages that their rivals did not possess. Yet the Ottoman presence in Gallipoli did not expand through immediate aggression. Instead, it settled into the rhythms of frontier life. Troops garrisoned the fortress. Supplies were transported across the strait. Families of soldiers and settlers moved into the region, establishing the early foundations of Ottoman administration in Europe. Markets began to grow around military outposts. Fields were cultivated. The land that had once been a contested corridor became, slowly and quietly, part of the Ottoman sphere. Control of Gallipoli allowed the Ottomans to observe the political currents of the Balkans with precision. They could support one faction against another, respond quickly to shifting opportunities, and intervene in conflicts where local rulers sought allies. Their involvement was often gradual, a negotiation here, a military escort there, but each step strengthened their influence. The crossing into Europe also altered the internal dynamics of the Ottoman state. It encouraged further development of logistical systems capable of sustaining campaigns across water and through unfamiliar terrain. It required new administrative methods for incorporating diverse populations, Christian and Muslim, settled and nomadic, into an expanding territorial framework. It reinforced the importance of standing military forces, whose disciplined ranks could be relied upon far from the Beylik's original homeland. In Gallipoli, the Janissaries played an increasingly visible role. Their discipline and cohesion allowed the Ottomans to maintain order in a region where unrest might otherwise have undermined their presence. Their ability to adapt to new environments supported the steady integration of the peninsula into Ottoman governance. They became not just soldiers, but symbols of continuity across the expanding frontier. The occupation of Gallipoli marked a profound shift in Byzantine-Ottoman relations. Byzantium protested, demanded the return of the city, and tried to negotiate its recovery. But the empire lacked the military strength to reclaim it. Each year that passed reinforced the permanence of Ottoman control, and each year their position in Europe grew more secure. In the decades that followed, Gallipoli became a launch point for further expansion. Ottoman forces moved northward and westward, establishing influence over parts of Thrace and forging alliances with local rulers who faced their own challenges. The region's political fragmentation created conditions similar to those the Ottomans had encountered earlier in Anatolia. Once again, they advanced not as conquerors sweeping through in a single campaign, but as a cautious, adaptable power that recognized opportunities where others saw disorder. The landscape of the Balkans also played a role in this expansion. Its mountains, forests, and river valleys created a complex geography that demanded careful navigation. The Ottomans learned these terrains as they had learned the hills and forests of northwestern Anatolia. They adapted their military strategies, using mobility, discipline, and calculated engagements to secure key routes and settlements. By the time Orhan's reign neared its end, the Ottomans had become a two-continent power. Though their holdings in Europe were still small compared to what they would later become, the symbolic weight of the crossing could not be overstated. It signaled an irreversible change, the beginning of a new direction in Ottoman history. The foothold in Gallipoli provided more than access to new lands. It revealed that the political structures of the Balkans, like those of Anatolia before them, were vulnerable to a power that combined discipline, adaptability, and stability. It showed that the Ottomans could move beyond the familiar frontier and establish themselves in territories shaped by entirely different historical and cultural traditions. Most importantly, Gallipoli demonstrated that the rise of the Ottomans was not confined to the land of their origins. Their story would no longer be the story of a single region, but of a power capable of crossing boundaries, geographical, political, and cultural, while carrying with it the administrative and military systems that had taken shape over several generations. From this point forward, their rise would take on a new momentum, expanding outward from the quiet shores of the Dardanelles into the broader landscape of southeastern Europe. Once the Ottomans established themselves in Gallipoli, the nature of their expansion began to shift. No longer operating solely along the Anatolian frontier, they now faced the intricate and layered political landscape of the Balkans, a region shaped by centuries of shifting borders, local rivalries, and the quiet decline of larger powers. The Ottomans did not enter this world with overwhelming force. Instead, they moved through it with a combination of patience, calculation, and a steady awareness of the opportunities presented by its internal divisions. The Balkans in the 14th century were not a unified space. Instead, they formed a mosaic of principalities: Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, Albanian, and others, each possessing its own traditions, loyalties, and systems of governance. Some were ruled by powerful families whose influence stretched across wide territories. Others existed as local strongholds, controlled by nobles whose fortunes rose and fell with each conflict. Intermittent wars, shifting alliances, and economic challenges shaped daily life. In this context, the Ottomans appeared not as an overwhelming foreign force, but as yet another contender within a region accustomed to constant negotiation and instability. Their approach to expansion reflected this environment. Rather than attempting to confront major powers directly, the Ottomans focused first on securing routes, villages, and smaller fortresses. These positions allowed them to stabilize movement between their holdings in Gallipoli and their base in Anatolia. Each secured position strengthened their presence, linking their territories into a continuous network that could support soldiers, administrators, and supplies. The first major step came with the capture of Simp Castle, a small Byzantine fortress gifted to the Ottomans during one of Byzantium's internal civil conflicts. Though modest in size, its strategic location near Gallipoli allowed the Ottomans to control surrounding territories and support further operations. The acquisition of Simp demonstrated a pattern that would define much of their early expansion. They did not rely solely on military conquest. They also capitalized on political fractures that offered openings diplomacy alone could seize. From these positions along the coast, the Ottomans gradually moved inland. Their forces advanced along rivers and roads that had served as arteries of medieval trade and communication. They targeted areas where resistance was minimal, ensuring that their supply lines remained secure. Villages and towns incorporated into their realm were often allowed to retain local customs and leadership, provided they recognized Ottoman authority and met obligations such as taxes and provisions. This approach encouraged stability. Communities that feared the disruptions of warfare often preferred accommodation to resistance. Local leaders, aware of the Ottomans' growing power, sometimes sought alliances or negotiated terms of submission. These agreements allowed the Ottomans to expand without exhausting their resources, and they created a network of cooperative territories that supported the next stages of their rise. The consolidation of the Balkans also required the Ottomans to adapt their administrative practices. As they integrated new lands, they recorded populations, assessed agricultural potential, and organized tax systems. They introduced timar grants, land revenues allocated to cavalrymen in exchange for military service. This system encouraged settlement and ensured that newly acquired regions contributed directly to the army's strength. In this period, the Ottomans also refined their balance between centralized rule and local autonomy. They recognized that the Balkans were home to diverse peoples with distinct cultural and religious traditions. Rather than imposing uniformity, they allowed communities to maintain familiar structures under Ottoman oversight. Local churches continued to function, village councils oversaw daily affairs, and nobles who submitted to Ottoman rule often retained their lands and privileges. This administrative restraint was not merely pragmatic. It created an environment where populations accustomed to uncertainty found an unexpected degree of continuity. The Ottomans did not dismantle social structures unless resistance required it. Instead, they positioned themselves as the guarantors of stability in a region long defined by its absence. As the Ottomans moved deeper into the Balkans, they encountered more formidable opponents. Serbian principalities, in particular, possessed strong military traditions and rulers who commanded significant loyalty. Yet internal divisions weakened their ability to form a unified response. Some leaders sought to oppose the Ottomans, while others attempted to negotiate, balancing short-term advantages against long-term uncertainties. This dynamic allowed the Ottomans to advance carefully. They avoided premature confrontation with major powers, focusing instead on securing territory that would support future campaigns. Each captured fortress became a node of control, each alliance expanded their influence, and each negotiated agreement reinforced the perception that the Ottoman state was a permanent and rising force within the region. The presence of the Janissaries strengthened this expansion. Their discipline, organization, and readiness for siege warfare made them essential in campaigns where fortresses played a central role. Their ability to maintain order in garrison towns created a stable environment for integration. Alongside them, the Timurid cavalry, mounted landholders who served in exchange for land revenues, provided speed and mobility in open terrain, giving the Ottomans flexibility across varied landscapes. In the rhythmic expansion of this period, one can observe the distinctive qualities that characterized the Ottoman rise: patience, adaptability, and a steady focus on integration rather than destruction. The Beylik that once survived on mobility and frontier opportunism was now developing the administrative and military sophistication needed to govern large and diverse territories. By the later years of the 14th century, the Ottomans had established a secure corridor stretching from northwestern Anatolia to key parts of Thrace. They controlled important roads, river crossings, and fortified towns. Their influence extended across regions where local rulers once acted independently. The Balkans, once a distant horizon, had become a connected part of the Ottoman world. This consolidation did not mark the end of their rise, but it signaled a new phase. With secure holdings in Europe, the Ottomans gained access to additional resources, manpower, and strategic depth. The political landscape of the Balkans continued to shift, and the Ottomans were increasingly positioned not as outsiders, but as one of the central powers shaping its future. Their rise, still quiet in many ways, had begun to gather a momentum that would soon reshape the region more profoundly than any force before them. The crossing into Europe, once a tentative step, had become a firm stride into a new era of expansion and state-building. As Ottoman influence deepened in both Anatolia and the Balkans, the state entered a phase that required more than expansion. It required coherence. The territorial mosaic that had grown through decades of steady conquest and careful alliances needed structure strong enough to bind its parts together. This task fell to Murad I, whose reign marked a turning point in the transformation of the Ottoman polity from a frontier principality into an increasingly centralized and stable state. Murad inherited a realm that stretched across 2 continents. It contained diverse populations: Turks, Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, Albanians, and others, each with their own languages, local elites, and customs. Some territories had come willingly under Ottoman protection, while others had been incorporated through conquest. If left uncoordinated, these differences could easily weaken the emerging state. Murad recognized that consolidation required not only military strength, but administrative clarity, a framework in which authority flowed from a central point outward, ensuring stability across expanding borders. One of the first steps toward centralization was the formal strengthening of the Divan, the council responsible for advising the Sultan and overseeing matters of governance. The Divan already existed in earlier years, but under Murad it became more regularized. Officials with distinct responsibilities, finance, military affairs, legal matters, were appointed to ensure the state's functions operated with consistency. The development of this council allowed the Ottoman ruler to rely not only on personal relationships, but on a structure capable of managing a large and diverse realm. The Timar system, already emerging under Orhan, matured during Murad's time. In this system, land revenues were granted to cavalry soldiers in exchange for military service. What made the Timar system effective was not ownership of land. The state retained that, but the right to collect taxes from it. This arrangement ensured that soldiers had a vested interest in maintaining security and productivity in the regions assigned to them. It also extended the reach of the central state. Each Timurid represented a direct link between the Sultan and the countryside, creating a network of loyal landholders who reinforced Ottoman authority at the local level. The system worked because of its balance. Soldiers received income and status. Communities received protection. The state received military service without the need to maintain a large standing cavalry. As the Ottomans expanded deeper into the Balkans, the Timar system became one of the central pillars of their governance, blending military and administrative functions in a way that supported rapid growth. Murad also strengthened the role of the qadis, or judges, whose presence in towns and cities ensured that legal matters were handled in accordance with recognized principles. Qadis served not only as judges but as administrators, recording transactions, overseeing disputes, and maintaining order. Their presence extended the authority of the Sultan into daily life in a peaceful, non-military form. Through the Qadis, subjects encountered the state not as a distant concept, but as a tangible presence that shaped local affairs with consistency. While administration grew more structured, the military continued to evolve. The Janissaries, once a small but disciplined force, expanded under Murad into a more prominent corps. Their training, organization, and loyalty made them a reliable foundation for campaigns that required coordination across varied terrain. They served not only in battle but in fortresses, maintaining stability in newly integrated regions. Their presence symbolized the shift toward a more centralized military power, one less dependent on tribal contingents whose loyalties could vary. Murad's development of the Kapikalu, the household troops directly controlled by the Sultan, reinforced this trend. These soldiers, including the Janissaries, formed the core of a centralized army whose command structure rested directly with the ruler. Their existence reduced reliance on provincial forces, giving the Sultan greater flexibility and autonomy in planning campaigns and responding to threats. Centralization was not a withdrawal from frontier dynamics. Rather, it created a foundation from which the Ottomans could operate more effectively. The empire could now sustain longer campaigns, manage territories farther away, and respond more consistently to internal and external challenges. The administrative structures that took shape under Murad allowed the Ottomans to shift their focus from mere survival and opportunistic expansion to strategic planning. These transformations occurred against a backdrop of continued expansion. Murad continued the policy of incorporating Balkan territories through a combination of conquest and alliance. As new regions came under Ottoman influence, their integration into the system became smoother because the mechanisms of governance were already in place. Villages and towns encountered a consistent administrative approach. Local elites understood their roles within the broader state. Taxation was more predictable. Military obligations were clearer. One of the defining features of Murad's centralization efforts was the integration of Christian populations into the Ottoman system. Rather than forcing assimilation, the state allowed religious communities to maintain their institutions under the millet structure that would later become more formal. Churches remained active. Local leaders retained influence. This approach reduced resistance and encouraged cooperation, reinforcing the perception that Ottoman rule brought stability to a region long accustomed to upheaval. Murad's establishment of Edirne as a major administrative center marked another step in centralization. Located in Thrace, Edirne became the effective capital of the Ottoman state before the eventual capture of Constantinople. Its position in Europe allowed the Ottomans to coordinate Balkan affairs with greater efficiency. Roads, supply routes, and garrisons radiated outward from the city, reinforcing Ottoman presence throughout the region. Edirne grew into a vibrant urban center, attracting scholars, artisans, merchants, and officials. It symbolized the shift of Ottoman focus toward Europe, where the state now possessed deep and expanding interests. The centralization efforts under Murad I created a model of governance capable of supporting a multi-regional state. The administrative, military, and legal structures did not erase local differences, but they provided a framework within which those differences could exist peacefully under a single authority. The result was a state that could absorb shocks, maintain order, and plan for long-term growth. By the end of Murad's reign, the Ottoman world had changed profoundly. The Beylik that once operated within the uncertainties of the frontier had become a structured and increasingly centralized state. Its systems of governance reached from the countryside to the cities, from Anatolia to the Balkans, ensuring that new territories could be integrated without destabilizing the whole. Murad's contributions did not carry the drama of great battles or sudden conquests, yet they shaped the very foundation of the empire. The strength of the later Ottoman state, its endurance, its adaptability, its administrative depth, rested heavily on the structures developed during this period. In the quiet work of centralization, the Ottomans gained the stability they needed to continue their rise. When Bayezid I ascended to power near the end of the 14th century, the Ottoman state had already established a framework of governance and military organization that set it apart from other regional powers. The structures shaped under Murad I gave Bayezid both stability to rely on and direction to pursue. What distinguished his reign was not the creation of new institutions, but the acceleration of the Ottoman rise. Under Bayezid, expansion became swift, coordinated, and driven by a confidence that reflected the growing strength of the state. Bayezid inherited territories in both Anatolia and the Balkans, each presenting different challenges and opportunities. In Anatolia, rival Turkish beyliks still controlled large areas. Some maintained independence through alliances, while others competed for influence. In the Balkans, Serbian, Bulgarian, and other local principalities remained powerful enough to resist, yet fragmented enough to be vulnerable. Bayezid approached these regions with a sense of urgency shaped by both political calculation and the momentum of prior decades. The nickname by which later generations would know him, Yildirim, meaning the thunderbolt, captured the quality most associated with his leadership: speed. His campaigns unfolded in quick succession, responding to shifting threats and opportunities with an agility unmatched by neighboring powers. Yet the speed was not hasty. It was made possible by the administrative and military systems already in place. Timur cavalry ready to mobilize, janissaries disciplined for field campaigns, and provincial officials capable of supporting operations across vast distances. In the Balkans, Bayezid continued the work begun by earlier rulers. He strengthened Ottoman presence in key cities and secured roads that connected Edirne with the interior lands of southeastern Europe. Local rulers, aware of the growing Ottoman power, often negotiated terms of submission that allowed them to retain limited autonomy in exchange for tribute and military support. These arrangements expanded Ottoman influence without requiring immediate conquest, creating a network of vassal states that reinforced stability. Yet Bayezid also pursued decisive military campaigns when necessary. His forces advanced into regions where resistance remained strong, transforming contested territories into integrated parts of the state. The expansion was not merely territorial. It also demonstrated that the Ottomans could match and surpass the military capabilities of established European powers. Victories on the battlefield strengthened Bayezid's position among both allies and subjects, reinforcing the perception that Ottoman authority represented the most reliable force in the region. In Anatolia, Bayezid's ambitions focused on unifying the Turkish beyliks under a single authority. The fragmentation of earlier centuries had created multiple centers of power, each with its own traditions and ambitions. While Murad I had begun incorporating some beyliks diplomatically, Bayezid pursued unification more directly. Through a combination of negotiation and conquest, he brought many of the remaining Anatolian states under Ottoman influence. Some accepted vassalage, others were annexed outright. This consolidation served two purposes. It secured the Ottoman hinterland, reducing the risk of internal challenges, and it strengthened the state's position against external threats by eliminating rivals who might align with foreign powers. The unification of Anatolia under Bayezid created a more cohesive and resource-rich base from which the Ottomans could project influence into new regions. Bayezid's reign also brought further refinement to the military. While the janissaries and Timur cavalry remained central, new forms of organization enhanced the army's effectiveness. Garrisons were strengthened in key fortresses, supply routes were protected with greater efficiency, and commanders were appointed to oversee regions critical to the success of ongoing campaigns. These measures allowed Bayezid to coordinate large-scale operations across multiple fronts without overextending the state's resources. The rhythm of his campaigns created a sense of continuity that shaped both internal and external perceptions of the Ottoman rise. Each conquest reinforced the previous one. Each new vassal state expanded the network of alliances. Each fortified position became a base for further expansion. The speed of Bayezid's actions gave the impression of unstoppable momentum, not because of reckless advance, but because of careful planning supported by solid structures. Bayezid's rule also reflected an understanding of the importance of urban centers. Cities served as hubs of administration, trade, and culture. Under his leadership, existing cities were strengthened, and new investments were made in public works, religious foundations, and infrastructure. These projects supported population growth, enhanced economic stability, and reinforced loyalty to the state. They also signaled that the Ottomans were not simply conquerors, but rulers capable of building and maintaining complex societies. Throughout the Balkans and Anatolia, Bayezid applied a consistent approach to governance rooted in the principles developed by his predecessors. Local elites were integrated into the Ottoman administrative system when possible. Religious institutions were allowed to continue their activities. Laws were applied through the established network of cadis. This predictability encouraged cooperation and reduced resistance. Populations accustomed to instability found reassurance in the steady presence of Ottoman administration. One of the most significant aspects of Bayezid's expansion was its effect on the state's identity. The Ottomans had begun as a frontier principality, shaped by mobility and survival. Under Bayezid, they emerged as a regional power whose authority extended across a connected and organized territory. This transformation marked a step toward empire, not through declaration, but through the accumulation of structures capable of sustaining a large and diverse population. The reach of the state now stretched from deep within Anatolia to significant parts of the Balkans. This breadth allowed Bayezid to mobilize resources on a scale previously impossible. It also meant that the Ottomans could influence diplomatic networks far beyond their immediate borders. European states, Byzantine remnants, and Eastern neighbors all monitored Ottoman actions with growing concern or interest. Yet beneath the speed and vigor of Bayezid's campaigns lay the same quiet principles that had guided earlier generations: adaptability, administration, and an understanding of local dynamics. The Ottoman rise was not fueled by sudden transformations, but by the careful layering of systems that could support greater ambitions. Bayezid's lightning expansion rested on foundations laid over decades, foundations that allowed the state to respond swiftly without losing stability. By the end of Bayezid's reign, the Ottoman world had expanded dramatically. The connections between Anatolia and Europe had deepened. The administrative structures of the state had strengthened. The military had grown more organized and capable. What had once been a Beylik on the edge of the Byzantine frontier was now a power whose influence extended across two continents. Bayezid's years of rapid expansion represented the culmination of earlier efforts and the beginning of a new stage. The Ottomans stood poised for even greater achievements, supported by systems strong enough to endure change and flexible enough to adapt to the shifting landscapes of the medieval world. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman state had reached a point of maturity unmatched in earlier generations. The structures laid by Orhan, strengthened under Murad, and energized by Bayezid had created a realm that stretched across the Balkans and Anatolia, linking cities, roads, and populations into a framework of administration and stability. Into this world stepped Mehmed II, a young ruler whose vision was shaped by the accumulated weight of a century of expansion. When Mehmed first ascended the throne, he inherited not a frontier principality, but a state capable of long-term planning and coordinated action. The Janissaries formed a disciplined corps of infantry. The Timar system supplied cavalry whose land revenues depended on service. Administrators governed towns and countryside with consistency. Edirne functioned as a central hub from which political, military, and economic life radiated outward. The state no longer reacted only to opportunity. It could now create opportunity through deliberate strategy. Constantinople, long the symbolic center of the Byzantine world, had remained outside Ottoman control. Its walls had withstood countless sieges across centuries. Its strategic position between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean made it a vital point of connection for trade and diplomacy. Yet by the 15th century, its territory had shrunk dramatically. The empire it governed had become little more than the city itself and pockets of land around it. Despite this decline, the city retained immense symbolic value. For Mehmed, it represented both a strategic necessity and the final step in transforming the Ottoman state into something larger. Before contemplating siege, Mehmed focused on preparation. He strengthened fortresses along the Bosphorus, ensuring that movement through the strait could be monitored and restricted. He improved the production and deployment of artillery, recognizing that the changing nature of warfare demanded new techniques. The Ottomans had already incorporated gunpowder weapons into their military structure, but under Mehmed, this integration became systematic. Artillery foundries produced cannons of varying sizes, and specialized crews trained to operate them. The logistics of siege warfare also required careful coordination. Grain, timber, iron, livestock, and stone were transported from various regions of the empire to support the army. Roads were secured. Ships were prepared to control waterways. Each action was part of a broader plan that unfolded gradually, reflecting the state's growing administrative sophistication. As the preparations advanced, the city watched. Byzantine officials sought support from European powers, but responses were constrained by distance, politics, and the realities of the time. Some aid arrived, but not at a scale capable of altering the city's circumstances. The Ottoman presence around the region grew steadier, a sign not of sudden aggression, but of long-term intentions supported by infrastructure and coordination. When the siege began in 1453, it unfolded as the culmination of years of preparation rather than a departure from Ottoman practice. The walls of Constantinople were formidable, built in layers that had resisted armies for centuries. Mehmed approached them with a combination of traditional siege tactics and new artillery methods. Cannons targeted specific sections of the walls, while fortress lines were surveyed to identify weak points. Ottoman troops rotated in organized shifts, maintaining pressure across different fronts. The janissaries formed the disciplined core of the infantry, advancing methodically, maintaining order, and holding positions even under difficult conditions. Their presence reflected how far the corps had come since its early formation. They were no longer a small, experimental force. They were an essential element of a state capable of sustained and coordinated action. The siege continued for weeks, shaped by the rhythms of supply lines, artillery fire, and defensive efforts from within the city. The Byzantine defenders, though outnumbered, resisted with determination. Repairs were made to damaged sections of the walls. Naval movements were coordinated to protect the harbor. Local populations supported efforts to maintain the city's defenses. Despite these efforts, the pressure exerted by the Ottomans was steady and unbroken. Their numbers, training, and organization allowed them to maintain a level of persistence that earlier besiegers could not match. As the siege extended into its later stages, cracks appeared not only in the walls, but in the city's ability to withstand the prolonged strain. When the walls were finally breached, it marked a turning point not only for the city but for the Ottoman state. Constantinople became the center of a new phase of governance. Mehmed did not treat the city merely as a prize of war. He saw it as a foundation for a more unified empire. He encouraged repopulation, inviting families from various regions, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, to settle within its walls. He restored markets, repaired infrastructure, and revived the city's administrative functions. Religious institutions were preserved, though restructured under Ottoman authority. Churches remained active, and the Patriarchate continued its work with Ottoman support. These actions reflected long-standing practices that balanced central authority with respect for local traditions. The city, once the heart of the Byzantine world, now became a center of Ottoman life without losing its complex cultural heritage. The fall of Constantinople signified more than the end of an empire. It marked the transformation of the Ottoman state into an integrated empire with a capital that connected Europe and Asia. It freed the Ottomans from the symbolic constraints of being a regional power. With the city under their control, they could direct their resources, diplomacy, and future conquests from a position of unparalleled strength. Mehmed's rule after the conquest focused on consolidating this new reality. Administrative reforms continued. Military organization strengthened further. Urban development accelerated. The empire's territories grew more connected as roads, ports, and fortresses linked distant regions into a coherent whole. Constantinople, now Istanbul, became a center of learning, trade, and governance that reflected the diversity of the empire it anchored. The road to empire, completed under Mehmed II, had been paved by generations of gradual development. The frontier resilience of Osman, the administrative grounding of Orhan, the military refinement under Murad, and the rapid expansions under Bayezid. Mehmed did not create the Ottoman Empire alone. He brought it to its decisive threshold. The fall of Constantinople marked the moment when the Ottomans stepped fully into a new era, one defined by stability, structure, and a capacity for governance on a scale that earlier rulers could only begin to imagine. The rise that had begun quietly on the frontiers of Anatolia reached its symbolic culmination in the city whose walls had long represented continuity and endurance. With those walls now part of the Ottoman state, The empire stood ready for centuries of influence, shaped by the foundations laid during its long, steady ascent. Across the span of nearly 2 centuries, the rise of the Ottoman state unfolded not through sudden transformation, but through a long series of gradual adjustments shaped by landscape, opportunity, and administrative skill. What began as a small frontier Beylik on the edges of a declining Byzantine world matured step by step into a centralized power with the capacity to govern diverse populations across continents. The early migrations from the steppe introduced traditions of mobility and resilience that shaped the character of Osman's community. In the fragmented lands of Anatolia, this small principality found room to grow, guided by leaders who understood both the promise and the uncertainty of frontier life. Under Orhan, the emergence of cities, institutions, and organized forces created the first outlines of a functioning state. As the Janissaries took shape and administrative systems matured, the Ottomans developed the discipline needed to pursue expansion with stability rather than improvisation. The crossing into Europe, first through the foothold at Gallipoli, marked a quiet but decisive shift. The Balkans, with their mosaic of principalities and shifting alliances, offered a landscape where the Ottomans could apply the same methods of careful advance that had served them in Anatolia. Consolidation followed, not through the erasure of local traditions, but through integration into a structure capable of supporting coexistence. Under Murad I, centralization anchored these expanding territories with systems that could endure. Under Bayezid, expansion accelerated, driven by a confidence supported by strong institutions. And under Mehmed II, the long arc of the Ottoman ascent reached its symbolic culmination with the fall of Constantinople, an event that marked the transition from regional statehood to imperial stature. By the time Istanbul became the new center of governance, the foundations of an enduring empire had been firmly set. Administrative coherence, military discipline, economic networks, and cultural diversity formed a structure capable of lasting influence. The rise of the Ottoman Empire was not the work of a single ruler or a single moment, but the cumulative result of generations who adapted steadily to a changing world. The story of their ascent remains one of the clearest examples of how states evolve not through sudden upheaval, but through the quiet, continuous shaping of institutions strong enough to withstand time.